the saving power of God. Alleluia, 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 alleluia. The Lord be with you. A reading from the Holy Gospel according to Matthew. Some of the scribes and Pharisees said to Jesus, "Teacher, we wish to see a sign from you." He said to them in reply, "An evil and unfaithful generation seeks a sign, but no sign will be given it, except the sign of Jonah, the prophet. Just as Jonah was in the belly of the whale 3 days and 3 nights, so will the Son of Man be in the heart of the earth 3 days and 3 nights. At the judgment, the men of Nineveh will arise with this generation and condemn it, because they repented at the preaching of Jonah. And there is something greater than Jonah here. At the judgment, the queen of the south will arise with this generation and condemn it, because she came from the ends of the earth to hear the wisdom of Solomon. And there is something greater than Solomon here." The Gospel of the Lord. Bible trivia time. All right. So all the Old Testament prophets, right, prophesied different aspects about the coming of the Messiah, but there was only one prophet who prophesied about the timeline for when the Messiah would come. Which prophet was that? Prophet Daniel. Remember the prophet Daniel, the 490 years, right? Gabriel appeared to Daniel and said 70 weeks of years will take place until the exile is over, right? Okay, now of all the Old Testament prophets, there was one prophet who prophesied where the Messiah would be born, right? He would be born in Bethlehem. Which prophet prophesied that? The prophet Micah, right? The prophet Micah. It comes from chapter 5 of Prophet Micah. We heard from chapter 6 today, but remember when the Magi came and they visited King Herod, right? They said they came to see the Messiah, and Herod asked his scribes, right, where the Messiah was to be born, and they all told him Bethlehem, and they quoted the prophet Micah. So we get to hear a little bit from the prophet Micah this week. Prophet Micah was living around the same time as Isaiah, and his message is very similar to the prophet Isaiah, although he's less well known. We heard from one of the most famous passages from Micah today, the very end of the first reading. "You have been told, O man, what is good, and what the Lord requires of you, only to do the right and to love goodness, and to walk humbly with your God." It comes from the prophet Micah. It's a very well-known passage. Now, something I just wanted to comment on today was actually about our gospel passage, where Jesus talks about the sign of Jonah. "An evil and unfaithful generation seeks a sign, but no sign will be given it except the sign of Jonah, the prophet." What exactly was the sign of Jonah? I think many of us are familiar with the story of Jonah, right? Being consumed by a great big fish, right? And was in the belly of that fish for 3 days and 3 nights. One of the things that is often overlooked about the prophet Jonah is that it was believed that he actually died. It wasn't as if he was in the stomach of the whale, right, alive. Many people think that he actually died because in chapter 2 of Jonah, after he's swallowed up, it says that he's crying out a prayer from Sheol, which was the place of the dead, right? So it makes a little more sense why Jesus would compare his own death with the death of Jonah. Just as Jonah had died and then on the 3rd day risen, right, the same way with Christ. Another thing that is often overlooked with the sign of Jonah. Perhaps the most important part of the story of Jonah was not so much his death and resurrection, but it was the conversion that his resurrection brought about. Right? Jonah famously, right, went to Nineveh after being swallowed up by the fish. Right? Nineveh was the capital of Assyria. And when Jonah went there and told the people that in 40 days God was going to destroy the city of Nineveh, right, the people repented. The king proclaimed a day of fasting among all the people. Right? And so God relented in his punishment and did not condemn the Ninevites. And so Nineveh continued to live on. Right? So foreshadowing of what would happen with the early Christians. Right? One of the most miraculous parts about the life of Jesus and the early apostles that is often overlooked is just how rapidly the world was converted, right, after the preaching of the early Christians. In a similar way, the conversion at the time of Jonah. And the last thing about this sign of Jonah, which is very interesting, is that Jonah, he was kind of hesitant to go and preach to the Assyrians. One of the reasons why he was hesitant to preach to the Assyrians is because the prophets Hosea and Amos, right, God had prophesied that Assyria was eventually going to come and take over the kingdom of Israel. Right? Assyria was the enemy of Israel. Right? And the Assyrians, in fact, they did end up come and convert and take over Israel. In a mysterious way, that's kind of like a foreshadowing what happened in the early church, that Rome was often seen as the enemy of Israel. Right? But lo and behold, many of the people in Israel did not convert, and yet the Roman Empire was very rapidly converted. And indeed, it was Rome itself that came and took over Jerusalem. Right? You can see all this imagery in the book of Revelation. This is one of the great themes in the book of Revelation. And so when Jesus talks about the sign of Jonah, right, there's a lot going on here when he speaks about the sign. There's great mysteries that can be found in trying to compare what happened in the story of Jonah to what happened in the early church.